Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a game played between Akiba Rubinstein and Emanuel Lasker. This was played in the 1909 Chigorin Memorial in St. Petersburg, Russia, and without further ado, let's look at this game. Rubinstein starts off by playing the move d4, and we have d5 by Lasker. Knight f3, knight f6, c4, and now e6. And now we have the Tarrasch defense. And after c takes d5, e takes d5, knight c3. This is all very normal, just normal development that each side is trying to do. And now c takes d4. And this is an interesting decision that Lasker decides to go for. He decides to willingly get an isolated queen pawn, which usually is a weakness, but in this game, let's see if that's a bit different. Knight takes d4, and now knight c6 is played by Lasker. So he develops his knight, and he's challenging the knight on d4. And obviously, if Rubinstein were to play this move, knight takes c6, b takes c6 could be played, and now this pawn is no longer isolated, and, well, you just gave up your powerful knight for not a really powerful knight from black's end. So e3 is played by Rubinstein. And now Lasker plays bishop e7, developing, and bishop to b5. Bishop to d7, and now we have bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, and now knight takes d5. So Rubinstein wins a pawn. But is that all to it? Is it just a winning position now for Rubinstein? Well, now let's see how the action progresses. Lasker plays bishop takes d4. Now after e takes d4, he goes queen g5. So what is he trying to do? Well, he's trying to target not only this knight on d5, but he's also trying to target this g2 pawn. And indirectly, this bishop on b5, because if this knight were to move to aid this g2 pawn, then you lose the bishop on b5. So Rubinstein first takes on c6, and now after bishop c6, defends with knight e3. And now he has an isolated queen pawn, and, now Lasker is going to try taking advantage of it. The thing is that after this bishop takes f6 move is played, you just lose a pawn on the spot. Bishop d7, however, was forced to defend the knight. Because if you move the queen, let's say to d7, you just get yourself in an awkward pin. And if you played something like queen c7, then the same idea, bishop f6 and knight d5. And Rubinstein is just better in that case. So that's why bishop d7, giving up a pawn, but now bishop takes d4. Not knight takes d4, because that would allow, first of all, bishop d7 check, and after queen takes d7, then just simply the move knight takes f6 check. And after g takes f6, queen takes d4, queen takes d4, e takes d4. Lasker's structure is just horrendous, and, well, Rubinstein can easily take advantage of this. Yes, he does have an isolated pawn on the d4 square, but if you compare that to the number of pawns that Lasker has that are isolated, there's a very big difference. And plus, Rubinstein can always put his rook on a very nice square that none of these pawns can chase away from, like f4, because no pawn can ever chase away the rook when it's on f4. So, knight takes d4 doesn't work, so bishop d4 was forced, and now e d4, queen g5, and now we have all of this. And now Lasker decides to castle queenside because he doesn't want to play bishop takes g2 and blunder his bishop. So he goes for the move castles queenside. Now after castles queenside, Rubinstein decides to castle kingside. And yes, he does save his material, but the difference is mainly in the piece play. Rook he8 is played now by Lasker. And now the idea is very simple. You want to play this move, rook takes e3. Because if this knight is gone, no one is defending the g2 pawn. And once the g2 pawn falls, it's checkmate. So rook takes e3 is the correct plan, right? Well, now Rubinstein goes rook c1, and it's not as simple as it originally was. Because after rook c1 is played, Lasker played rook takes e3 in the game, yes, but that doesn't mean it's the best move. Rook takes c6 check. Now, after b takes c6, how does Rubinstein prove that he has good compensation? Of course, if Rubinstein were to just hastily grab this rook on e3, then queen takes e3 check. And it's actually Lasker who has lots of compensation, because after something like king h1, just rook takes d4. And once the queen maybe goes back to e6, then Lasker's position is completely fine. And it's Rubinstein who needs to work a bit harder to win the game. So fe3 isn't exactly the best way to go. So what does Rubinstein play? And I'll let you try figuring this out. Okay, so Rubinstein played the move queen to c1, and this is a very brilliant move he played. It pins this rook on e3 to the queen on g5. And what it's trying to do is now, after f takes e3, it's not only trying to fix the pawn structure, but it also shows that Rubinstein is trying to aim at this c6 pawn, which is very weak. And if this pawn falls, then maybe Rubinstein has chances not in the fact that it's because of positional play, but maybe it could just be because of material. And after queen c1, he's threatening c6. You can't defend with the rook on e6 because then you lose the queen. And if you defend with the queen, you lose the rook mainly to f takes e3. And then the pawn structure is fixed and Rubinstein is better. So, rook takes d4. Now, after rook takes d4 is played, you could take on c6 with check. That's true. But f takes e3 instead. Why? Well, because you need to remove the rook first, and after f takes e3, you're now threatening to play the move queen takes c6. So now Lasker is given the one opportunity to play the move rook d6, yet he doesn't do that. And why is that? Well, because if rook d6 is played, then there's rook takes f7, simply getting the pawn back. And yes, there might be attempts like queen h5 to try attacking the rook, but also trying to nicely play this move rook d1 and get some material advantage. However, Rubinstein can either play rook f3 or rook f1, but in either case, it prevents the idea of rook d1, and now Lasker's rook is just looking very silly on d6. So rook d7. And Lasker does give up the pawn on c6, and after king d8, now Rubinstein goes for rook f4. He wants to play this rook to e4 and then try getting in some ideas like queen a8 check, maybe rook c4 check, and you see how vulnerable the king is. The pawn goes to f5, and now Rubinstein goes for the move queen c5. His main plan is to go for queen f8 check, and then yet again bring this king out, let's say to c7, you get rook c4, and you're in a lot of trouble here if you were playing as Lasker. So now Lasker tries to trade the queens off, which he does successfully, but now the pawn on f5 is lost. Why don't you capture the queen with the rook, you might be asking? Well then, just the simple move, rook takes f5, and even if you lose this pawn on e3, that's not a big deal, because rook f7, and now you're targeting all of these pawns in the 7th rank. The only way to really defend all of them would be to want to trade the rooks off, but that's not really going to end out well for Lasker, because he's just down a pawn, and there's just a 2-to-1 majority on the queen side. And this would prove to be very fatal for Lasker. So not rook takes e7, instead king takes e7. You do lose the pawn on f5, but now with hopes of trying to activate the rook, rook d1 check was played. You might be wondering, why was rook f1 not played here? Well, it's because now rook d2. You're attacking the b2 pawn, and if the rook goes to b1, it just becomes very passive, and then the king can just get activated. And if after rook d2 you continue with rook f2, then maybe Lasker can even get a draw out of this. So that is why the move king to f2 was played, willingly sacrificing the b2 pawn, but now rook a5. And if we assess the material now, Rubinstein is still up a pawn, so it's okay with giving up the b2 pawn. So now Lasker goes rook b7, guarding the pawn, and now rook a6. Rubinstein makes sure that Lasker's pieces are as paralyzed as possible. The king goes to f8, and now e4. Now this pawn is going to advance up the board and at least try to cut the king off from a couple of squares, but it's also trying to slowly but surely help aid the advancement of the king. Now, rook to c7 was played by Lasker and h4 by Rubinstein. King to f7, and now g4. King to f8, king to f4. And now comes the move king to e7. Lasker doesn't know what to do now, so he's just shuffling between his king to move from different squares. h5 and now h6. The king goes to f5 and now king to f7. e5. Very nice timing with this e5 move, because you stop ideas like rook c5, which could perhaps expose the king. Now with e5, you're not only trying to go e6 check and then bring the king to g6, but you're also just shielding your king from any checks. So rook d7, rook d6. Why do you go rook d6 here and not play something like e6 check? Well, because if you go e6, then just king to f8. And yes, this is actually winning. But after rook b4, there are still chances that Lasker has. And maybe, just maybe, he may even find ways to get a draw. If you can bring the king back to f5, and then like check here, the king, if it goes back to g6, would allow rook g5 check, and then it just allows Lasker too much initiative. So instead, just rook d6. And the idea is that now if you try to bring the rook to b4, you just get rook d7 check, and the 7th rank is weak. So king e7, rook goes back to a6. Why? Because now the rook can freely move to somewhere like b4, and then it'll just get counterplayed. So with rook a6, now of course if you move the rook away from the 7th rank, then you just lose the a7. And now, after king f7, rook d6. And the king goes back to f8, which is a bit strange because before it went back to e7, which makes you think, why did it go back to f8 this time? That is a bit of a question to me as well, and I do not understand why this king went from e7 and then it just went back to f8. So the king goes to f8 and now rook c6. You're trying to use this pawn to go to e6 and then infiltrate with king to g6. King goes to f7 and now the pawn advances to a3. And after this a3 move was played, Rubinstein just won the game. And it's because Lasker is completely paralyzed. If he moves the king maybe back, then you just bring the king forward. If the rook goes to maybe e7, for instance, then you just go for the move e6 check. And you trade the rooks off. This is simply it. After the rooks are traded off, king g6. And if black tries king f8, then just e7. Use this pawn as a decoy. And look at that. Your structure is completely shattered. And yeah, that's an easy win for Rubinstein. Now, there are also other ways you can win. Rook e7 is one way to lose here as Lasker. But if you do anything else, then you just allow Rubinstein's pieces to advance forward, and it's only going to help Rubinstein. So that's why after this a3 move was played, Lasker resigned the game, and a very brilliant victory for Akiba Rubinstein. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.